Thank you very much. I'm aware that round of applause wasn't for me. So my name's Philip Cowley. I'm chair. Thank you. Thank you. You're still getting 2 2s. I don't need to introduce tonight's speaker because that's why you're here. Those of you that have been to these events before will know the format. I do my sort of slightly lame Jimmy Young style questioning for about 30 to 40 minutes, then we throw it open to you. And the frustrations that have been building up as I've failed to ask the questions you want asked can be relieved, and you can then pile in and ask whatever you like. Mr. Speaker's already very generously done an hour-long session with the students, which was fantastically informative, so I'm hoping that what follows is just as great. You were elected Speaker in 2009, just after the expenses scandal, which you said caused reputational carnage to the House of Commons. And a few years later, you said, "I cannot think of a single year in the recent history of Parliament when more damage has been done, with the possible exception of when Nazi bombs fell on the chamber in 1941. Now, we are currently in another scandal. How do you see the two? I mean, do you see this one potentially as damaging as the scandal of 2008?
It could be, but I hope and am cautiously optimistic, Phil, that it won't be for 2 reasons. First, and I say this with a degree of caution and humility, because I cannot be sure, I don't think that anything like so many people will be caught up in this latest scandal as were, to a greater or lesser extent, caught up in and implicated by the expenses scandal of 2009. So I think sheer numbers won't be as great, and therefore that might, and probably will, limit, not remove, not render insignificant, but limit the damage. Secondly, I think that we will get to grips with it by acting speedily and effectively, both to ensure that people who are suspected of wrongdoing are investigated, and in particular to ensure that a complaints mechanism is established which is characterized above all by independence. Independence is key. Independence is absolutely front and center stage to giving people confidence to come forward and complain, and giving people confidence to believe that not only can they come forward and complain, but they can get a fair outcome, including, if appropriate, restitution. So I'm not diminishing the significance of this. It's a real and big challenge, but I think almost learning from past scandal can help us react to and deal with it better. And I think for the other reason I've explained, it's not quite in the same category as the expenses scandal. By the way, I should just say, in responding to your first question, Phil, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me. And I have a rather Anarakish devotion, ladies and gentlemen, to visiting universities, because I enjoy meeting, talking to and hearing from students and academics and members of civil society who turn up very often at events of this kind. And in particular, I'm very keen to get round all of the 20 universities participating in the Parliamentary Studies module, which is part of a politics degree, in some cases part of a joint degree. And Queen Mary College London University is the 13th of the 20 that I've visited, and I'm keen to get round the remaining 7. Now, this is a great university, whether you measure it by research excellence, whether you measure it by teaching excellence, whether you measure it, indeed, by the gold award that the university won, to its huge credit, for its work in public engagement. So it's a fantastic institution, and very different from other universities within the Russell Group, as has been explained to me, the makeup of this place is dramatically different. The tremendous ethnic mix here is hugely to the credit of the university. The number of students who are international, and indeed the percentage of students who are coming to university for the first time. And can I just say that I empathise with those students. I'm told it's 49% of the students at the university who are the first in their family to go to university. I empathise with those students because I'm in that position myself. I'm not suggesting, I'm not claiming that I come from a hugely impoverished background, but I come from a very ordinary background. I went to a state school. I have had two parents who were perfectly capable of going to university. My father couldn't dream of going to university. He was brought up in Dalston in Hackney in the 1930s. His parents didn't have two halfpennies to rub together, and the overwhelming expectation was that he and his three siblings would leave school, work, and contribute to the family upkeep. My father would actually have been rather a good barrister. He spoke in paragraphs, and he was a highly intelligent fellow, but there was no way he was going to go to university. My mother left school at 14 in Huddersfield. She was the daughter, quite uncommonly at the time, she was the daughter of a single mother, and she left school and got a job as a junior reporter on the Huddersfield Examiner and then eventually gravitated to London. I'm proud to say my father died 30 years and more ago. My mother is still alive. My mother finally got a degree in English literature from the University of Middlesex in the late 90s, age 69, and I was thrilled that she had the chance to get that degree, which she did, of course, for fun. It's just a pity that her entry to university was delayed by more than half a century.
That's your personal journey to the speakership. Can I ask about your political journey to the speakership? Because normally, you almost strike me as being unique amongst politicians that I've met, in that many politicians who fall out of love with their party tell a story in which the party has changed, and they've been constant. And you are pretty unique in accepting that it's you that changed. You've been on a massive political journey since you were, since I first became aware of you, when you were on the right, and not just on the slight right, involved in the Monday Club. And I just wonder, what was it that led to that journey?
You're absolutely right. I changed. The Conservative Party didn't. It's changed in various ways from time to time, but not very fundamentally. I changed. I think probably one should distinguish very briefly between the two types of change. In the case of the Monday Club, of which I was a member, a very right-wing pressure group on the fringes of the Conservative Party, anti-immigration, pro-repatriation of immigrants, and very hard line on all sorts of things. The case of the Monday Club, in an act of quite extraordinary stupidity and folly and lack of self-awareness, I joined the Monday Club to my abiding shame in 1981, aged 18, and I resigned 3 years later, having had a year of not being involved at all. But I finally resigned in January or February 1984, and I wrote to the chair of the club saying that the club contained elements whose views I found unpalatable. The truth is, I came across people who were profoundly racist, including people who were profoundly anti-Semitic, and I am myself of Jewish origin. I had no business joining the Monday Club at all, but I joined, I think, partly because, as a young man, I was rather ideological. I became quite attracted to an ideological brand of Conservative politics, and quite apart from Mrs. Thatcher, to whom I was very politically attracted, I was at that time very attracted to Enoch Powell, who seemed an extraordinary intellect and logician and rhetorician, and I read his various books of speeches and was inspired by them. But it was completely wrong-headed and mad to join the Monday Club, and as I say, I very bitterly regretted it later. But I just came to think, well, this is a racist organisation and I should have absolutely nothing to do with it. My only plea in mitigation is that if most people in this audience believe in the Rehabilitation of Offenders Act, I would hope that 33 years later, it is acknowledged and accepted that I'm a very different person today than I was then. In the case more widely, post being elected to Parliament, of shifting from being a Thatcherite right-winger when I was first elected to being very much in the centre ground of politics, to the extent that some people speculated that I might defect to the Labour Party, which I never intended to do, but nevertheless I shifted substantially. Why? A mixture of factors, Phil, two to be precise. First, the experience of devastating electoral failure for my party. It wasn't so much 97, colleagues, when the Conservatives were slaughtered. It was more 2001, funnily enough, when after 4 years of the Blair government, of which I had rather disapproved, and my colleagues had rather disapproved, and my party had rather disapproved, Tony Blair got back again with another scarcely reduced majority. His majority went down from, if memory serves me correctly, 178 to 167. And that made me think, well, clearly he's doing something right and we're doing something wrong. And that was then the second thing. I thought, well, what is it that is unattractive about our party? We're viewed as quite nasty and prejudiced, not very interested in the rights of women, not very interested in minorities, ethnic, sexual, or otherwise. Not very interested in the quality of our public services, which had been heavily underfunded and Labour had started to restore, and not very bothered about huge gaps between the rich and the poor and the plight of people in our inner cities. And I basically just started to think about those issues. And the more I thought about them, the more, without wanting to shift party, I thought my party has got to react to Blairism in the way that Labour shifted to the centre to take account of the achievements and potency and appeal of the Conservative Party under Mrs. Thatcher. And there was one issue, but it led to all sorts of other issues. There was one issue on which I first changed my mind, which may seem a small issue, but for me it was big. I had voted at least once, if not twice, for the retention of the statutory discrimination against gay people for the unequal age of consent. And I think in doing so, I was uncomfortable. I did so, as most Conservatives at the time did, but I thought, I'm not quite sure what the rationale for this statutory discrimination is. And I went away and talked to teachers and to people in the church in my constituency, and it was quite obvious that the statutory discrimination was really just historical and symbolic. And it didn't achieve any benefit, and arguably it was damaging in health terms to a lot of young people who couldn't be open about their sexuality, because you couldn't be openly gay before the age of 18. And so I decided, well, next time this matter comes up, I'm going to vote for reform. And there was a Tory MP who's now in the House of Lords, a really decent, patrician, moderate, left-of-centre Tory MP called Tim Boswell, himself straight, married, parent, I think grandparent, whatever, who'd long supported an equal age of consent at 16. And Tim said to me, John, if you've decided to vote for change, can I offer you a word of advice? And I said, please do. And he said, speak in the debate. A, because you should explain to the House why you've changed your mind. And B, he said, the House is rather tolerant of and receptive to people who want to explain a change of heart. It was very good advice, and I took it, and I voted for 16. And it then led, this may seem curious to you, but it led to me rethinking my attitude to quite a lot of other matters. So all I say whenever I'm accused, and it's sometimes done in an accusatory way, not by you, but it often is, when I'm accused of having changed my political views on a very substantial scale, I always say it's absolutely true. I'm not seeking to deny it for one moment. The only thing I say is that it is an honest change. I didn't change my political views as some really down-market fifth-rate scribblers have sometimes suggested in order to become Speaker. That is, to be blunt, bullshit. And it is very low-grade bullshit. I changed my views because I changed my views. And the fact that subsequently that both attracted huge opprobrium from my party, the Conservative Party, and a lot of support from other parties, it is a matter of fact, but it wasn't done as an act of political opportunism. It was done as a matter of political conviction.
In the session with the students just now, you quoted Speaker Lenthal, the famous 1642 quote. You did it from memory, but I'm going to read it out because my memory is not as good as yours. May it please your majesty, I have neither eyes to see nor tongue to speak in this place, but as the house is pleased to direct me, whose servant I am here. It struck me several times while you've been speaker that your view of the speaker goes a little bit beyond that occasionally. You don't just do as the house directs you. You are trying to lead the house places sometimes, particularly on reform, where you've had to take people with you, but where there is a distinct Bercow view.
Yes.
Has that been difficult at times, or is there, how do you find the appetite for reform amongst your colleagues?
It can be difficult because there are quite a lot of colleagues, notably people who've been around a long time, but not always exclusively people who've been around a long time, who are not so keen on reform, who feel, well, things are fine as they are, and why do we need the speaker proselytizing for change or seeking to be a catalyst for or a trailblazer of change? We don't need all this change. So it can be challenging, and I also accept your point that whereas Lenthal saw himself as simply doing what the House said, I absolutely admit that I have tried to be a bit more than that. I suppose I feel that what's changed, which makes it legitimate, Phil, is that whereas the speaker just used to emerge and actually was often a very reluctant occupant of the chair because it was very hazardous, certainly before the English Civil War, to be speaker, because if the speaker displeased the monarch, the speaker would be sent to the Tower and have his head chopped off, literally, and no fewer than 7 of my predecessors met their end on the executioner's block. In the modern age, people want to be speaker. That old, slightly pompous, almost slightly snobby idea, it's a poor show for a chap to show that he wants it, and if he wants it, he's probably bloody unsuitable for it, and you're supposed to be a sort of reluctant hero. That's gone. People want to be speaker. It's an office, and there were 12 candidates in 2000. When I stood, there were 10 candidates. I don't think it will be uncontested ever again. Therefore, you set out your stall. People literally now, I did, publish manifestos. There were hustings last time. So, I felt that I had a democratic mandate, and I was very clear that if you elect me, you're electing someone who wants to bring about necessary, overdue, and broadly, not necessarily unanimously, but broadly desired change. I admit that I have sometimes pushed it a bit, and some people think, oh, well, John pushes too hard and sometimes sort of overreaches himself. Generally speaking, I think, if I may say so, it has been effective in that we have achieved over the last 8 years a lot of change. I say we, not just I, but the House has achieved quite a lot of change, and I think I've played my part in that. Have I sometimes mishandled something or overreached myself? Yes, I'm very happy with the outcome to a row 3 years ago about the position of clerk of the House, which a lot of you may not even remember, but a few of you might. There was a row when the clerk retired, and I felt very strongly that the clerk should not also be the chief executive of the House. The clerk is a procedural specialist with a very deep understanding of and experience in parliamentary procedure, the legislative process, standing orders, the interpretation of Erskine May, the Bible of Parliament. And it is a very learned person. But there is no particular likelihood on the law of averages that that person will also be the person that would have been top of the school at the Harvard Business School. And the skill sets are just different. And the idea that the person who's clerk of the House should also be in charge of the management of the House as a service provider and as a deliverer of fairness to employees, and as somebody who can decide what the building project should be, and in what order and how they should be choreographed and so on, struck me as bizarre. And so I said, well, the roles should be split. Now, at the time, I think I tried too little, too late, and too ineffectively to get an official split between clerk and chief executive. The clerk himself, the outgoing clerk, was very unsympathetic. He thought the status quo was fine. The leader of the House at the time was Andrew Lansley, who was similarly I don't mean this in a hostile, nasty way, but he was just unsympathetic to my point of view. He didn't agree with me. And therefore, I sort of decided, well, I would try to bring about a change by having a wider variety of applicants invited. And I remember saying, well, just as the clerk can be a chief executive, wrongly in my view, the chief executive, somebody with a chief executive background, can be the clerk. There are loads of other clerks who are experts in parliamentary procedure. And the clerk of the Welsh Assembly and the Scottish Parliament, for example, is not a parliamentary specialist. That person is, in many cases, an ex-civil servant with experience in running things, running an institution that's an employer or a World Heritage Site or whatever. So I tried to do it that way, and I ran into trouble. And in the end, we got the split in roles, but it was done in a rather messy way. And if I look back, although I'm very pleased with the outcome, and I've no fundamental regrets, did I handle it as well as I could have done or should have done? I didn't, but I learnt something from it, and I still maintain that, albeit in a slightly messy and controversial way, we got to the right point in the end.
What about a more recent example, the issue of the Trump state visit, where you pronounced on your view of the Trump state visit from the chair? I mean, as far as I'm aware, there was no vote. I mean, I think I could probably guess what quite a lot of members would have thought, but that wasn't the House speaking, was it? That was you speaking.
Well, that was me speaking. I mean, I was making the assessment. There I'm completely unrepentant. You know, I've shown that I'm mildly repentant in relation to the handling of the Clark saga.
We'll see if we can get more than mildly repentant in a minute, but let's, yeah.
Okay, well, and I've also been extremely repentant about my stupid past in the Monday Club 33 years ago. I mean, I suppose I could own up to all sorts of other sins, real or imagined. I mean, I could say to you, yes, I streaked naked down Colchester High Street at the age of 20 in 1983, but it would suffer from the disadvantage of being untrue. So it might amuse you, but it would be wrong. No, I'm not repentant about the Trump thing, and I'll tell you why. Yes, I was speaking my own view. I had a sense that I was speaking for a majority in the House. I was unscripted, as I very often am, in fact, usually am. So I didn't have a text in front of me, and some people think I spoke more forcefully than I should have done. But Stephen Doughty, a Labour MP in Wales, had raised a point of order with me about the process, ladies and gentlemen, the process for inviting a visiting dignitary to address both houses of Parliament, Commons and Lords, specifically in Westminster Hall, which is the most prestigious setting where President Obama spoke and Aung San Suu Kyi spoke and Mandela spoke before my tenure. And he wanted to know what the process was. And he was hostile, very much hostile to Donald Trump coming and speaking in Parliament, but he'd read various press reports to the effect that there was likely to be a visit, quite probably a state visit, and that Trump would come to address Parliament. And I'd seen it suggested that he would be invited, and the suggestion seemed to be emanating from government. And I, frankly, was keen to get the point across, of which a lot of people were not aware, that, frankly, whether there was a state visit was way above my pay grade. I think I used the expression way beyond and above my pay grade. That's a matter for the Prime Minister. If she wants to invite President Trump to the UK, that's absolutely for her, and she would no doubt discuss it with the palace if it was a state visit and so on. But the question of whether there's an invitation to address both houses of Parliament is not a bauble to be handed out by the Prime Minister of the day. It's not a government prerogative. That is a matter for the speakers of the two houses. Now, I apologise subsequently to Norman Fowler, the Lord Speaker, because I hadn't consulted him before I made my remarks. But then I didn't know that I was about to get that point of order from Stephen Doughty, and I gave Stephen an honest answer. And I stand by my view that there were two good reasons. I think I focused principally on one, why Trump should not be invited to Parliament. The first and overwhelming reason was that I felt there was huge controversy attaching to President Trump, and I think I said before the imposition of the migrant ban, I would not myself have favoured an invitation to President Trump to address both houses in Westminster Hall, and after the imposition of the migrant ban, I'm even more strongly opposed to the idea. I think I spoke on that occasion for quite long enough. There was actually, however, a second reason, and that was that it was incredibly early in Trump's presidency. It was true that Barack Obama had come, and I'm still very proud of the fact that we invited Barack Obama to address both houses of Parliament in Westminster Hall. But Obama was elected president in November 2008 and took up the presidency in January 2009, and he came and addressed us in Parliament in May 2011. And that was much more in keeping with what one would expect. The idea that the prize should be offered to President Trump within weeks of his election struck me, frankly, as absolutely extraordinary. And to those who say, well, I was expressing a political view, the House has said that the Speaker has a role in this matter. You can't be impartial as between wanting to invite someone and not wanting to invite someone. So I don't accept that I breached any impartiality obligations. And to those who said, oh, well, the Speaker's trying to crush free speech, ladies and gentlemen, forgive me, it's not about free speech. The President of the United States can always find places where he can make a speech. And I don't think President Trump has any difficulty in that regard. The issue is not about free speech. The issue is this. An address to both houses of Parliament is not an automatic right. It is an earned honour. And my view was that he had not earned that honour, and my view is that he has not earned that honour. Now, I guess, Phil, that I could see, fairly quickly that it was going to cause some reaction. But I mean, I think, we can all make mistakes. I don't think that was one of them. But did I ever think, well, this is going to be fatal for me? No. I mean, there were people who were very angry with me, and a small number of MPs who tabled a motion of no confidence in me. But I genuinely felt, and it's very relevant to your point about, are you just speaking for yourself? I genuinely felt that I was speaking for a majority of my colleagues. And a lot of the Labour Party was almost, well, I'm certain to a man and a woman opposed to Trump coming, but a lot of Conservative members, as people do, came up to me privately and said, well said, Mr. Speaker, I don't want Trump coming here. Now, were they necessarily going to speak out in public? No. But did I feel that I was speaking only for a minority of the House? Frankly, I thought then, and I think now, that I was speaking for a large majority of the House. And I do feel that, to be honest, everything that has happened since has really served to vindicate my view.
In terms of dealing with members, there's a lovely description of you once as being like a Victorian head teacher overseeing a noisy assembly. Do you ever sometimes think you've gone too far when you put someone down? Have you ever apologised to someone afterwards for the way you've responded?
Yes. Yes, I think I have. I think I have gone over the top. I mean, I think on the whole, going over the top and being overly aggressive and overly angry was more a phenomenon of my early period as Speaker, because I think that something would annoy me, or I think that behaviour was untoward, and I would get very cross. And then over a period, and it may seem to you very obvious, but I think I wasn't a natural for it at first. I think I was naturally quite strong and authoritative, and I think I had a good memory, and I knew what I was doing in the chair, but I was sometimes overly abrasive and sharp with people. And then I think after a period, I thought, look, it is better to diffuse situations with a bit of humour and sort of gently to tease a colleague into being quiet or into recanting of some sin that he or she had committed. So I think most of the really angry stuff was early on, and I was sometimes over abrasive. And then once recently, I absolutely admit, we all make mistakes. Once recently, I was convinced that a member had arrived too late. You're not supposed to stand to ask a question on a ministerial statement if you weren't there at the beginning. And I was convinced that a particular member had come into the chamber way after the statement had started. But it just turned out he'd been there, or he'd either been there or elsewhere in the chamber for some time. And I was just wrong. But I said, order, members who arrived after the start of the statement should not be standing and expect to be called. And I noticed that this chap carried on standing, and I was annoyed about it. So I eventually sort of rounded on him and said, I said, if you arrive late, you shouldn't expect to take part. And the member concerned came beetling up to the chair to say, I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker, but I genuinely don't know what you're talking about. I've been here for 40 minutes. And I think he'd been sitting elsewhere. So I was wrong. And when I did eventually come to call him, I apologised to him. Now, obviously, you don't want to be doing that too often, otherwise it detracts from your authority. But I think that, when you do make a mistake, the best course of action is just to say, I'm very sorry, and an absolutely fulsome and unqualified apology. I did the honourable gentleman a disservice. He was here, and we must now hear him. And he very graciously came up to the chair and said, I'm sort of surprised that you get it right as often as you do and wrong as rarely as you do, or worse to that effect. He was very civil and courteous about it. But yeah, I have sometimes got it wrong, but I've tried to learn from that.
One of the innovations under your speakership is that Prime Minister's questions, which used to finish religiously after 30 minutes, has begun to creep up in length. In fact, the last one was over 50 minutes, so it's not even just sort of a couple of minutes here and there anymore. I mean, I have multiple thoughts about this. One of them is that given it's the least edifying bit of the entire parliamentary process, shouldn't we keep it to a bare minimum?
Right.
But what's the logic for letting it go on for almost twice its scheduled length?
Well, it doesn't always, but it sometimes does. The logic, basically, ladies and gentlemen, is that the original logic for extending it a bit, which was not extending it as much as I'm currently doing, was that if the Prime Minister had begun with a statement about recent deaths, in combat or some humanitarian tragedy, that was perfectly fitting and proper, and I wasn't protesting about it, but I didn't think, frankly, that it should be taken out of the time allocated for members to question the Prime Minister. So I used to think, right, well, we immediately need a bit of injury time because the Prime Minister has taken a minute or 2 minutes or whatever to make that announcement or to express that regret or tribute. I also thought, well, if there's a lot of noise and heckling, and I keep having to interrupt to calm people down, why should backbench members lose out? The Leader of the Opposition will always get his 6 questions because they come early in the session. That's the way it is. You tend to call the Leader of the Opposition at the point at which he wants to be called. But backbenchers who are lower down on the list, or who haven't got a question on the order paper and are trying to get what we call a free hit, which is when there are 2 members of the same party in succession, I immediately look across the House for somebody from the other side to break it up. Why should those people lose out because of the amount of heckling there's been? And then more recently, I'm afraid I've felt, and I'm not wanting to knock either of them, both are impeccably courteous to me, and I've had very good relations with both Theresa May and Jeremy Corbyn, but the exchanges between the front benches sometimes take a very long time. And I appreciate they're important, but I think it's also an occasion for backbenchers to question the Prime Minister. So I've tended to take the view, right, well, it's 12:18, and we've only got to the end of the exchanges between Theresa May and Jeremy Corbyn. And sometimes it's been 12:20, 12:21 after Ian Blackford, the SNP leader, has finished his 2 questions. But I've still got 14, 15 people on my list that I want to get through. So I'm afraid I basically take the attitude, well, let's extend it. Let's have backbenchers heard. Now, I'm told that the fellow who runs the Daily Politics programme and the Thursday night programme, the late night programme, Neil, Andrew Neil? Yeah, Andrew Neil. Yeah, now I'm told that he used to preserve the last 10 or 15 minutes of his Daily Politics programme on a Wednesday to talk about how Prime Minister's questions had gone, and that it greatly irritated him that that opportunity for him and his guests was missed because question time was still running on because of me. Well, it may come as a most enormous surprise to Andrew Neil, who cannot be accused of attaching insufficient weight to his own position or place in the world. But the running of Andrew Neil's programme and his personal convenience or even opinion is not a material factor in my thinking. Now, he may say that that's absolutely shocking, but I couldn't give a flying flamingo what he thinks. I'm concerned about trying to do the right thing for the House, and I haven't generally had protests. You can't please everybody, but I haven't generally had protests.
In a recent speech you gave, you outlined 3 reforms that you would like to see made to the Commons. You'd like the right of the House to recall itself under specific circumstances, the reform of private members' business to make it less easy to talk out or otherwise block private members' legislation, and you'd like a House Business Committee, the one bit of the right committee that recommendations that has not been implemented. Given that one mistake reformers often make is to want too much and then fail to get any of it, if you could only have one of those 3 reforms, which is the most important?
The most important day to day is the House Business Committee. It may sound, ladies and gentlemen, really dull and uninspiring, but it is actually very important. We have had, since 2010, a backbench business committee, which is normally known by the shorthand BBCom. Capital B, backbench, capital B, business, capital C, committee, recommended by the Right Committee, championed even before the Right Committee was set up by me and other people, by me and my campaign to be Speaker. I said, I can't make this happen on my own, but I'm standing as a candidate who thinks that we should establish a backbench business committee. It's time the House, I think I used the expression, took control of its own core functions. So BBCom chooses the business one day a week, and it's backbench business, it's non-government business, but the backbench business committee will choose for debate something that backbenchers, maybe on the basis of an electronic petition, constituency representation, personal views, often cross-party matters they choose for debate, whether the government or the opposition front bench would want that chosen or not. And some backbench business committee debates have made a real difference. There was one which led to a huge Conservative backbench rebellion, which eventually led to the Tory party changing its position to being in favour of a referendum on British membership of the EU. Now, whether you think that's a good thing that they changed their position that way or not, what I'm saying is BBCom was effective in that matter and in a number of others. But we were also supposed to have, as you say, a House Business Committee so that government business would be scheduled. It would be decided what was debated and when and for how long, not by the government whip's office, almost cursorily or maybe better than cursorily consulting or informing the opposition whip's office, but with the government whip's office very much in the lead, deciding what would be debated. It would be a House Business Committee, capital H, capital B, capital C, with opposition members on it, maybe the chair of the liaison committee or a prominent select committee chair and other backbench representatives. I wasn't trying to boost my own power. It wouldn't ideally be chaired by the Speaker. It would probably be chaired by the senior Deputy Speaker. Ideally meeting in public, though it wouldn't have to, and discussing and debating what shall we debate next week and the week after, and then resolving the matter with a votable proposition to the House. A perfectly sensible, modern, inclusive, democratic way to decide what is discussed, instead of which it's still decided by the government. Now, the Conservatives and Liberal Democrats committed to the creation of a House Business Committee. If I'm charitable, I'll say, well, the reason it didn't happen, and it was supposed to be by the 3rd year of the 2010 to 15 Parliament, it's simply because the sheer weight of business and governmental responsibility caused a momentary lapse of memory on the part of the Prime Minister and his Liberal Democrat coalition partners. They simply forgot. They overlooked it. They meant to do it. They didn't get around to it. In fact, being less charitable but more factual, that wasn't the explanation. What happened was that I think the backbench business committee proved to be rather more potent than Prime Minister Cameron had envisaged or ever wanted. And there was an occasion when Peter Bone, an outspoken independent-minded Tory MP, asked about the House Business Committee. And either because he misunderstood or perhaps deliberately, Cameron started banging on about the backbench business committee, which already existed. And he said how many days it had for debates. And Peter Bone called out, "Not enough." And very revealing it was that David Cameron replied, "My honourable friend says not enough. Let me say to him, more than enough." And that was very revealing. It was obvious that Prime Minister Cameron, frankly, wasn't best pleased about how significant an actor on the parliamentary stage the backbench business committee had become, and he was clearly determined to snuff out the chance of a House Business Committee. And as I've often had cause to observe, David Cameron was perfectly entitled to his view on that matter, but he did suffer from the rather material disadvantage of being wrong.
Three short questions to finish off, and then we will take Q&A from the floor. The best speech you've heard since you've been Speaker?
The most moving of all was Alison McGovern's speech in a backbench business committee-inspired debate on the Hillsborough disaster, in which he was pleading for a major inquiry, and that has happened, and there's still work to be done, into the historical verdict that the fans were to blame for the Hillsborough disaster back in 1989. And Alison was eloquent and passionate and well-informed and visibly moved. She's quite an emotional person, a strong person, but quite an emotional person. And you could hear a pin drop. She made a huge impact on the House. And am I saying that she's the best public speaker or parliamentary orator I've ever heard? No, I'm not suggesting that at all. I don't think she would claim that. She's very good, but I'm not suggesting that. But that was the outstanding speech that I remember more than any other. And if I picked a second, I would say Mike Freer, who's a Conservative MP in North London, Finchley. Mike Freer's speech in support of equal marriage on the same-sex marriage legislation was a stunningly good speech, a very brave, a very personal, and a very powerful speech. So during my speakership, those are the best two. Otherwise, I suppose, if I look back at who the best parliamentary orators have been in my time, people often talk about William Hague. Well, William Hague's a very, very good speaker in an Oxford Union sort of way. But the two best speakers I heard in my time in the House of Commons before I became Speaker were, in no particular order, Malcolm Rifkind and Robin Cook. I mean, Robin Cook was not just a very fine speaker. Robin Cook was, I think, the most formidable debater that I heard in my time in the House. I mean, that man had a razor-sharp mind. He was so quick. And, of course, I wasn't there for his arms to Iraq speech in the mid-90s. I wasn't a member of Parliament then, but it is said that he made the most brilliant speech, which did the Conservative government huge damage. But, I mean, Robin was a formidable intellect and a formidable parliamentarian. Robin wasn't always enormously popular. I don't want to speak ill of him. I came to admire him enormously. He wasn't always hugely popular, partly because he found it not only difficult, but quite unnecessary to conceal his view that he was by some margin the cleverest person in the room. But he was.
On the subject of great parliamentarians, the question that I often ask at the end of these sessions, but I think you've already answered it, is who was your political idol when growing up? But I take it from your earlier answer that your political idol when growing up was Powell.
I really had two. Margaret Thatcher was a heroine of mine, and I am very ashamed of it, because Enoch Powell's views on immigration and race relations and repatriation were absolutely wrong, and they were immoral, and I think they were hugely damaging to race relations for a considerable period, to the reputation of his party, and I completely disagree with him and have done for over 30 years, but just to be absolutely clear about that. But at the time, if we're talking when I was growing up and becoming interested in politics, age 16, I met Enoch Powell a number of times, and at the time I admired him, and I was wrong-headed about that, but I did, partly because he was a formidable speaker and very clever and so on and so forth. He was utterly wrong. Margaret Thatcher I regarded as a heroine, and I met Mrs. Thatcher. I went to listen to her speak at the last public meeting in the Finchley constituency that she held when she was leader of the opposition, just before she became Prime Minister in 1979. And I suppose I must have been quite pushy, because I sidled up to the front at the end of the meeting and met her and said how much I'd enjoyed her speech. And I was 16 at the time, and I've always remembered, I think it was either the 1st of May 1979 or April the 30th, 79, and she said to me, "Mr. Bercow, are you a member of the Young Conservatives?" And I said, "Well, I'm afraid I'm not, Mrs. Thatcher, but I have come to hear you, and as I've said, been greatly inspired." "Well, you most certainly should be," she said to me. And she proceeded to tell me where to go to join, and I was very impressed by her. I mean, I still think she was a huge figure, and she was a transformative Prime Minister in the way that Attlee, well, not in the same way, but she was a transformative Prime Minister, one of the two most transformative Prime Ministers of the post-war period, Attlee being the other. And she was brave and gutsy, and she was in a male-dominated party, and she beat the lot of them. And she was very formidable, but she was also profoundly wrong about a number of things. And there were huge gaps in her record. And you know, my hero, is she today a heroine of mine? No, absolutely not. I've got a number of heroes. Martin Luther King, Gandhi, Eleanor Rathbone, who was an amazing parliamentarian representing the university's constituencies, who did huge amounts for women and for Jewish victims of Nazi genocide policy and so on. So there are various people who are heroes or heroines of mine. And is Mrs. Thatcher a heroine of mine today? She isn't. And is Enoch Powell? Absolutely not. But, you know, I'm trying to answer you absolutely honestly.
And final question. If you had a piece of advice for a young person interested in going into politics, what would that advice be?
Do something else before you go into Parliament. You know, I'm all in favour, Phil, of people, massively in favour of people getting involved in politics as young people. I'm absolutely passionate about public engagement generally and engagement with young people in particular. I spend a lot of time going to schools, not just in my own constituency, which any MP ought to do, but more widely, and universities. And every year I chair the UK Youth Parliament on its annual sitting in the House of Commons on a non-sitting Friday. It's tomorrow, by the way, the 9th year in succession I'll have been chairing it, and I always go to their conference wherever it is in the UK, and I've done that since 2009, and will go on doing that if they want me to do so. And I always say, get involved, join a party, join a pressure group, publish a pamphlet, get involved in campaigns. But if you want to be a parliamentarian, you should definitely do something alongside any youthful political activity different from politics. You shouldn't go to university, become a research assistant to an MP, and then become an MP. You should get a job, whether it's in industry or commerce or the city or the health service or teaching or the charitable sector or working to fight global poverty or whatever it may be. A, because it will make you a more rounded and better MP when you get there, and B, because it will actually make it more likely that a political party will select you as a candidate. So that, I think, would be my advice. When you got into Parliament, if any of you young person goes into Parliament, what would my advice be? It would be to do one thing I didn't do, you know, in trying to progress as a parliamentarian. I honed my debating skills and my questioning skills, my power of interrogation, my knowledge of parliamentary procedure by spending a huge amount of time in the chamber. But I was very much a generalist. I was a sort of jack of all trades. My strong advice to anybody newly elected to Parliament would be specialise. 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 Don't try to be a generalist. Don't try to take part in everything. Establish a reputation on one subject or possibly two, and if it's two, preferably very different subjects from different government departments, and maybe one domestic and one international, in which you are really respected by the House, and don't try to pop up on everything. People who try to pop up on everything tend to be heard less respectfully. And I think that, you know, I think I became a good debater and a good questioner, but I think that for quite long periods I was probably rather discounted because people thought, oh, there goes John. You know, he feels he has to sound off about everything. And that was a valid criticism. If I started again, I think I would try to specialise earlier.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. We will now take questions from the floor. We should have some microphones, I think. Brilliant, thank you. You can pop up and sound off on anything now in the way you were just told not to. So let's take this chap down here in the white T-shirt. We'll start there. If we can keep questions as short as possible, and we will try to keep answers as short as possible, and then we'll try and cram as many of you in as we can. So you first, sir.
If you talk to the average person on the streets about PMQs, they probably wouldn't have a very high opinion of it. Do you think that it's a place for scrutinising the government, or do you agree with a lot of people who would say that it's too raucous?
I do think that it allows scrutiny up to a point, and I wouldn't want to get rid of it. I've lost count of the number of countries I've visited around the world where they say we wish our Prime Minister had to come and respond to questions each week. So I wouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater by scrapping it. But you put it very succinctly. Do I agree with those very large numbers of people who will say it's too raucous. The short answer is I do. The fact is, it's not representative, ladies and gentlemen, of the rest of the week. Most of the rest of the week, it's much quieter. I won't say necessarily cerebral, but sometimes quite cerebral, and much more measured, fewer people attending, because people tend to attend when they want to speak, and that's perfectly proper. There are lots of other elements to the MP's job. It's not like sitting in a classroom. People can be doing other things that don't require them to be in the chamber. But the rest of the week's very different. But the fact is, PMQs is what, by a huge multiple, is most seen and heard by the public. And if the decibel level causes Deep Purple, which was the loudest band in the world in the 1970s, to be regarded by comparison as positively sotto voce, well, we're spray painting our shop window. And I think most people don't like it. Look, we're never going to be a group of Trappist monks, and we're not an Oxford Union debating society. There are real and passionately held different opinions, and people now and again get angry when real people's lives are affected by policy. So I don't say there shouldn't be a bit of anger. I don't even say there shouldn't be a bit of noise. I don't think it's a disaster if there isn't the occasional heckle. But when there is braying and catcalling and orchestrated barracking and heckling and attempts to shout people down, I think it gives a terrible impression. I didn't answer that part of Phil's question. He sort of implied, well, given that that's characteristic of PMQs, wouldn't it be better to finish it earlier? Well,
Or maybe not have it.
Or not have it. No, I think that the answer is, all I can do is deal with the manifestations of disorder by calming a member down. I try to do it humorously, by saying, I had high hopes for the Honourable Gentleman's apprenticeship to become a statesman, but it's quite obvious that he's got some considerable distance still to travel, or, I tease a member that, he's making too much noise and maybe he should take some sort of soothing medicament which will have the desired effect. But it will only really get better, and it should. And maybe the current scandal is another opportunity, and I will underline this when I next meet the Prime Minister and leader of the opposition. Maybe it can change, but it will change fundamentally away from this very, very aggressive culture only when the party leaders want it to. That's the brutal truth. I can deal with the symptoms, but it will only change fundamentally if the leaders and their whips want it to. If the leaders and their whips say to the backbenchers, I do not want mass noise. A bit of cheering for me, fine, but I do not want constant barracking when opponents are speaking. If they said that and gave out that instruction, behaviour would be changed overnight. It hasn't changed overnight, and you can deduce from that the obvious conclusion that the leaders haven't wanted it. I wish they would, and I hope they will. And if they do, things will change.
Okay, let's go for the chap in the blue jumper there, D, down here.
It's a very short question. Could you talk us through the events of the last 48 hours of the 2015 Parliament, or the 2010-2015 Parliament?
Yes.
And who do you blame?
Do you know, I'm not absolutely certain of that. Your question is self-contained as far as I'm concerned, but not as far as the audience is concerned. Ladies and gentlemen, right at the tail end of the 2010-15 Parliament, there was an attempt to change the rules on the re-election of the Speaker after a general election. And the motion tabled by the Leader of the House, if passed, would have meant that instead of the Speaker being re-elected after a general election by a straightforward vote of the House, which had always been the case, it would have required simply one person to shout no, no, no to the proposition that I return to the chair, and there would then have had to be a vote by secret ballot. Now, the argument for the secret ballot, in my view, is flawed, but the argument in a nutshell was now that the Speaker is elected by secret ballot, he or she should have to be re-elected by secret ballot. That thesis is fundamentally flawed because the proponent of it is not comparing like with like. When there is a vacancy for the Speaker, and there's a number of candidates, The House decided, I didn't actually favour this as it happens, but the House decided that it would conduct the election of the Speaker by secret ballot so that colleagues could privately choose who they wanted to be Speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, at a general election, the Speaker, by long-standing convention and express preference of the political parties, does not stand as a party candidate. I haven't been a member of the Conservative Party since the day I was elected, since the night I was elected Speaker in 2009. The Speaker stands as the Speaker seeking re-election. And again, by convention, the major parties don't oppose the Speaker. And the working assumption, therefore, the logic is that the Speaker is re-elected in his or her constituency to the House as MP for the constituency, but in the expectation that he or she will continue as Speaker. And the major parties have supported that. So I think it's not unreasonable to assume that if, notwithstanding that re-election of the House, somebody wants to vote the Speaker out, somebody should be prepared to go through the division lobby to express that preference. I think that David Cameron, William Hague, Michael Gove thought in the run-up to the 2015 election that if it was left to a straightforward division of the House, I would be re-elected again. But that if they could make it a secret ballot, people might think, well, within the privacy of the secret ballot, and particularly if they were encouraged by Cameron, Hague, Gove, etc., they might be inclined to try to vote me out. What happened was that there was no plan for that reform to be discussed by the end of that Parliament at all. The Procedure Committee was not asking for it in that final week. The Procedure Committee had actually argued for the vote to come forward earlier, and the government had ducked it. And then the Leader of the House at the last minute sprang a surprise. Such a surprise, he didn't even tell, and in a monstrous parliamentary discourtesy, he didn't even tell the chair of the Procedure Committee he was bringing forward the Procedure Committee's report and proposing to have a vote on that motion. And it wasn't a free vote, it was a whipped vote. The Tory Parliamentary Party was kept back to hear a presentation by Linton Crosby with a view then to voting on that motion. And William Hague came to tell me about it at 5:30 p.m. the night before to say the government was that night tabling that motion. And he said it will be a free vote. Well, it wasn't going to be a free vote. Now, the House defeated that motion, and I say openly to you, sir, as I've said on a number of other occasions, that was hugely to the discredit of the government. Quite a lot of Tory MPs rebelled against it, and the motion was defeated. So I was re-elected after the 2015 election by the normal method of a parliamentary division, and there was none. Nobody objected to my return to the chair. As far as whether it was Cameron, Hague or Gove is concerned, I'm pretty clear in my mind it came from the top. The Leader of the House should not just be the government's representative in the House. The Leader of the House, the best Leader of the House in history, the best leaders of the House in history have recognised that it's their duty to be the House's representative in the government. And William Hague should have said, this is ridiculous and discreditable, and I will have no part of it. To his great discredit, he didn't take that attitude. He was happy to act as David Cameron's agent, and it was a display of malice and incompetence on an industrial scale. Put very simply, Hague made a mess of it on his last day in Parliament. Sad, sad, sad. And my friend, I know I do tend to be rather gentle and restrained and understated in these matters. One of these days I'll tell you what I really think.
Now I've been doing microphone. All right, I want someone to have testicles. So, there, brilliant, thank you. Right on cue.
You cited Labour's re-election in 2001 as one of the factors in your centrist shift. So my question would be, do you think the Tory party needs some rebranding? And if so, how should they do it?
Well, that I think, thank you, Torin. We met earlier because you were part of the Parliamentary Studies module class, is a very political question, and I think that I should be very careful in my response to that. Look, there's no secret that, you know, when I was a member of the Conservative Party, because I shifted from the hard right to the centre, I became a strong and insistent advocate of the modernisation of the Conservative Party. I think the Conservative Party needed to move to the centre. I think it needed to become much more interested in public services and much less obsessed with tax cuts. It needed to have a view ranging way beyond Europe, and it shouldn't obsess, or as David Cameron put it, keep banging on about Europe. It needed to be much more female-friendly and ethnic minority-friendly and inclusive in its approach. Whether the Conservative Party did change in that fundamental way is a debatable point, but certainly David Cameron brought about a substantial change in the public face and the image of the Conservative Party. As I say, whether it really changed very fundamentally is another matter. Theresa May herself was an early exponent of the case for modernisation. In a famous party conference speech, she said that the party had come to acquire, she wasn't saying that it should have done or that it was necessarily accurate, but she said it had come to acquire the reputation of being the nasty party, and it needed to change that. And I'm very much in agreement, you know, with that view. That was certainly my view at the time. And I mean, I think I was an outrider myself for modernisation. I was in favour of more modernisation earlier, and I was of that view, with all due respect, considerably before David Cameron was, but he was the facilitator of change. I think it's a continuing challenge for political parties to modernise, and that challenge certainly applies to the Conservative Party, but I'm not sure it's really for the Speaker to specify what the route map to Conservative change should be. I mean, suffice to say, I do think on the whole, elections are won in the centre ground, and political parties that want to win elections have their core vote, yeah, the Tories' case on the right and in Labour's case on the left. But if they're going to win in the centre ground, I think they win with a focus on quality of life issues, the state of the public services, prospects for people in retirement, an attitude to our international obligations. And I'm sure all of that is known to Theresa May. The challenge, of course, for Prime Minister May is to navigate a path to progress for her party and her government in a situation in which she doesn't have a natural majority. So it's a huge challenge for her. I don't want to pass judgment on her. I think it would be totally inappropriate for me to do so. The only thing I would say is that for all the problems that she's got and the pressures that she faces, I've myself always found her courteous, and I've always had good personal relations with her, and I don't think it's the revelation of a state secret to say that I get on better with her than I did with Prime Minister Cameron. And I used to get on well with David when we were the first pair in the House of Commons and House of Lords tennis team, where I must say, in fairness to Cameron, he was a very good partner, McEnroe-like in intolerance of his own mistakes, but pretty tolerant of mine. But after we ceased to play together for the House of Commons and House of Lords tennis team, our relationship seemed permanently to deteriorate.
Okay. Oh, now they're all flying up. We'll take the lady in the middle of the back row there. Yes, yeah. We'll get a mic to her, that'd be great. And we have got about 15 minutes, so let's keep questions short and answers short, and we'll try and cram as many people in as we can.
Okay.
Lisa Nandy, when she came, talked about how she's habitually sort of, well, when she first started, she was sort of shouted down by male members, and how there is a real fight for women within the House. What do you think you have done as Speaker to sort of battle sexism in terms of like when female speakers do speak?
Would you just speak up a little bit? Forgive me. What do I think I've done to tackle sexism?
Sexism in the House as Speaker, the time that you've been Speaker.
What do I think I've done to tackle sexism? First, I've tried to encourage more female participation, not by having a mechanistic approach that says, you know, I've got to call X number of women or in this particular order, but I've got an instinctive sense that I do not want to be calling, if I can avoid it, 6 men in a row. I don't want to be doing that. I'm constantly looking for a balance between parties, a balance between intakes, people who came in 40 years ago and people who came in a few months ago, a balance on particular subjects between proponents of one point of view on, say, Brexit, and proponents of an alternative point of view on that same subject. And I'm constantly thinking about the gender balance in debates. That's one thing that I've done in a way that I suspect perhaps it wasn't done so decidedly or with such a focus in the past. Secondly, very early on, and this isn't just about women, but it is about family friendliness, I took the view, frankly, it was absolutely ridiculous when I stood for election as Speaker that there was a shooting gallery in Parliament where people could go pistol shooting, but there was no nursery which MPs and staff could pay for to broker a better work-life balance. Well, 8 years later, I'm pleased to say we have a nursery which MPs and staff can pay for, and it's very well subscribed indeed, thank you very much, but we have no shooting gallery any longer in the House because it's been closed down, and that seems to me to be an altogether more satisfactory state of affairs. I have myself also commissioned research from Sarah Childs, Dr. or Professor Sarah Childs, who's written a wonderful report. She's an academic at Bristol University and well known to Phil. She's written a report called The Good Parliament, which is an intended route to a gender-sensitive parliament. And a number of the recommendations of that report I am keen to take forward. One of them was to start by establishing a committee on representation and inclusion, a cross-party committee that I chair, proposals for baby leave and the possibility of proxy voting when people are taking maternity leave are coming forward, and I want to see those aired and debated and voted upon in Parliament. And there are other proposals, for example, to do with having gender-balanced select committees and other committees of the House, which I strongly favour. So, you know, I have done a bit, and I've also worked on the staff side, leaving aside members for a moment, the staff side. I've worked hard to try to ensure that more capable people in the House, women, ethnic minorities, are promoted in the House service or attracted to apply to work in it in the first place. I launched an initiative to give more younger female clerks, rising procedural specialists, the chance to serve at the table, which the clerks regard as the Holy Grail, to serve at the table in front of the Speaker in the chamber. And some of the old guard senior male clerks were completely taken aback. But I asked the senior clerk at the time, how long will it be before X, a young, middle-ranking female clerk, how long before she serves at the table? Well, it's very important, Mr. Speaker, that she has the competencies. And I said, yes, and I appreciate that, but there are other clerks at the table. She could be mentored, but answer my question, how long before she serves at the table? And eventually, it became clear to me that it was going to be about 15 years before this youngish, but not very young clerk in her early 40s was going to have the chance to serve at the table. Exactly. How ridiculous is that? Well, we've changed that, but we need to do more. And I've worked hard to recruit into the House the first female and BME Speaker's chaplain in the history of the House, the first BME Sergeant-at-Arms, Kamal Mohammed Al-Haji, in the history of the House. It was once a woman, but otherwise it was always an upper-middle-class male, usually ex-military. Kamal's doing a great job, and I've recruited the first female and BME Speaker's Counsel, senior lawyer, in the history of the House. So is there a lot more to do? Yes, a lot more to do. I'm not at all satisfied. I don't think the record's good enough, but I am trying to make progress, and I think I am making progress.
You do realise if you allow proxy votes, that the whips will kindly offer to be the proxy vote.
Yeah. That is a risk.
Just to help you out.
Yeah.
I'm just offering to help you out.
Yeah.
I'll take it off you while you're on maternity leave.
I think it has to be, Phil, I think you're right. I think there's some sense that the whips might be keen on it if it's given to the whip to cast. I think my feeling is that it has to be for the member to decide. By the way, look, the whips have an important role. I'm not saying that there shouldn't be a role for whips. There is a role for whips, just as in any decent public health system, you have to have sewers. And, it's very important. But the important thing is that the whips should know their place. I always had, when I was a Conservative MP, I had a relationship with my whips characterised by trust and understanding. I didn't trust them and they didn't understand me.
You do realise that the sewers line is an Enoch Powell line.
I didn't know that. Is that right? Okay.
Right, let's take, we've got time for maybe two more. Let's see if we can take them together. We'll take the chap there with the specs and the dreadful T-shirt with the red arms and the white, that one. And we'll take...
What about a woman?
And then the woman there with the blonde hair on the end. So yes, please, sir, first. Let's take both questions together and
Yep.
take the answers together.
The Palace of Westminster is in a dreadful state of repair and there aren't enough seats for enough legislators. Do you think it's time for Parliament to move to another building or even another city, such as Manchester or Leeds?
Okay, and then the blonde woman about 3 rows back.
Whilst it's right for Parliament to put measures in place so women or men can report inappropriate behaviour, in the light of the suspected suicide of Carl Sargent, what should be done to protect the frailties of the accused?
On restoration and refurbishment, that work will have to be done. There's an argument about whether it requires decant or not, and I would like a decision to be made. It's not for me to make, but a decision does have to be made. Do I honestly think that we should have a completely new building? No, I don't, because I think there's a lot to be said for our building, and to construct something completely new would probably be even more expensive. The fact that the chamber doesn't seat everybody, in my opinion, doesn't particularly matter, because there are only a couple of occasions a year when, apart from PMQs, when most people are just sitting to observe, there are only a couple of occasions a year when people can't sit down, and that's the day of the budget speech and the day of the Queen's speech. And I think that if you change the chamber, the intimacy would be damaged and the acoustics would probably be inferior. So I don't think personally that that's a problem. And moving to another city, no, I'm in favour of having political debates, perhaps between the party leaders or between the Health Secretary and the Shadow Health Secretary, or the Education Secretary and the Shadow Education Secretary, in either big town halls around the country, possibly chaired by the Speaker, and if people wanted it, or in great universities around the country. And I think there'd be a lot of interest. I don't think people are uninterested in politics. I think they're often irritated by the way the spats take place. But are they interested in the issues? I think they are. I don't myself favour going outside London to one of the big cities, because the fact is, even with modern communications acting as a help, government departments are principally based in London. And I think it would not be workable to have that and ministers having to travel to debates in Manchester on a day-to-day basis. In terms of protection of the frailties of the accused, I think that's incredibly important in the light of what's happened in Wales, but it was predictable. And even if people are suspected of wrongdoing, they may well need and should be given help, understanding, support. For example, it may be, I'm not referring to any particular case, but it may be that somebody who is suspected of committing or has committed an offence, or even something that's not an offence but is widely regarded as an abuse. Such a person might have real problems in his or her own life and needs support in tackling them, or living with them and managing them. And I think that is part of our responsibility. But the other point, which is absolutely front and centre stage, is this. I'm reluctant to get into any one case because they all tend to involve members of parties, and I'd rather not at this stage get into individual cases. If a member is going, for example, to be sacked or denied the whip of his or her party, for God's sake, that member is entitled to know of what he or she is accused. And that member is entitled to learn, if a judgment has been made about suspension or dismissal, of that suspension or dismissal first-hand, not first through the media. It's a bit like our attitude, if I may say so. Okay, it's not the same issue, but it's a bit, in terms of principle, it's analogous to the way we behave in relation to terrorists. We have certain standards, and we, I hope, insist on upholding our standards. The fact that a terrorist or a would-be dictator doesn't care about human rights and is willing to slaughter innocent people in pursuit of his or her prejudices doesn't mean that we should operate in the same way. We believe in fair trial. We believe in innocent until proven guilty. We believe in due process. And okay, on a different scale and in a different level and in a different way, but the principle that we give people due process, and in fact not give it out of a spirit of generosity, but we have an obligation to provide it, is absolutely unarguable.
One more. Right in the middle. Oh, actually, let's take down here. Bearded, slick back thing.
I'm
Thanks for
just going
noticing.
to plant this thought in Phil's mind, and he may say no, because all things have to come to an end. I'm willing to take one more clutch of questions if you let them, but I hate disappointing
people. Let's take three very...
Okay.
No, don't all... We'll take three very quick ones. So we're going to take Greaser Slickback Boy over here. Then we're going to take this woman down here, Phoebe. And then we'll take the chap... Yeah, no, rather back row there. Chubby's going to soil himself if he stretches any higher. Right, so, go. Quickly.
Given the success of your career since, do you have any regrets surrounding your time in the Shadow Cabinet in the early 2000s? And did you have any ambitions for one of the big four positions in government?
Thank you.
This lady here.
Hello. Given the recent allegations that are happening regarding the sexual allegations, you've pushed for an independent process. You've supported an independent process, but you've also left the handling of the matters with the respective leaders of the party, given that they have sort of intentionally or unintentionally fostered such an environment where people couldn't come forth and speak. Do you think that that's wise, and do you think that it is an obligation of yours to take a more active role in leading the change?
Thank you.
And then the chap right on the back, yeah.
Does the continued presence of hereditary peers in the House of Lords cheapen it as a function of democracy?
The continued presence of hereditary peers in the House of Lords, does it what? Cheapen it.
Cheapen it as a function of democracy.
Thank you. Right. Did I, in the light of my shadow cabinet career in the early noughties, regret the way it ended? I mean, first of all, I resigned over the Conservative Party's imposition of a three-line whip on Tory MPs, including, of course, members of the Shadow Cabinet, to vote against the right of unmarried and gay couples jointly to adopt children. I thought that matter should not be the subject of a whip vote. I was in favour of the right of unmarried and gay couples jointly to adopt children, and I pleaded with Ian Duncan Smith not to impose that three-line whip, but he insisted on doing so, and so I said, well, in that case, I must leave the Shadow Cabinet and speak and vote in accordance with my own conscience. I think, actually, although I hugely enjoyed a year or so later getting a year as Shadow International Development Secretary, and it fueled my interest in the fight against global poverty, so I don't regret it in a big way, I think it was probably a mistake to come back onto the front bench under Michael Howard. My wife and I normally understand each other, but she was surprised at the time that I wanted to come back. I'd just become a dad, and she thought that, it wasn't a great priority, and to come back, she thought I should bide my time. And in a way, it was probably a mistake, and it ended badly in that I fell out with Michael Howard, which frankly wasn't sort of terribly difficult to do, but I did. and I ended up being sacked by Michael, although actually Michael did me a great favour. He probably won't welcome me saying it, but Michael did me the most enormous favour in dismissing me from my post and offering me an alternative post which I didn't want and which I refused to accept, and therefore which caused me to leave the front bench. He did me a huge favour because it was that frankly caused me to make up my mind. No, I don't want any of those top jobs. I'm not very good as a team player. I'm not a very good team player. I didn't, frankly, greatly admire any of the Conservative leaders under whom I served. I didn't really think any of them was going to become Prime Minister. And in that sense, I was right. And I didn't want to be a minister. And I thought, no, I've got to resolve this dilemma. When I'm on the back bench, I want to be on the front. And when I'm on the front bench, I want to be on the back. And this is a recipe for unhappiness. So no, it decided me, no, I'm going to stay on the back benches. I'm going to pursue my causes. I'm going to try to get on the Speaker's panel of chairs that chair debates in Westminster Hall, the subordinate chamber, and bill committees. And then when the speakership comes up, I'm going to see whether there is support for me. And if I think I've got a decent chance of winning the speakership, because I'm passionate about Parliament, about debate, about representation, about backbench opportunity, about scrutiny of the executive, I'll have a go. So do I have any regrets that I didn't become a minister? No, I think it's far, 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 far more fun and stimulating to be Speaker. Should I take a more active role in the resolution of the sexual harassment scandal? And, given that the parties, in a sense, almost have been the genesis of the problem, I think there is a role for me to play. I certainly think as far as parts of House process are concerned, we can look at improving those. So where we've got a respect policy that covers House of Commons staff, MP staff are not employed by the House of Commons, we can look at extending that policy and seeing whether we can make it more widely available to MP staff and others. That does have to be looked at very carefully, but that doesn't mean that I'm trying to long grass it. I want that work to get underway. I also do believe there's a role of advocacy for me. I think I can legitimately say, and I do believe, that the code of conduct for MPs should it include now a specific provision, as the Parliamentary Standards Commissioner recommended some time ago, on harassment and bullying. And if it did, then complaints about harassment and bullying would be justiciable, could be adjudicated by, they'd be adjudicable by the Parliamentary Standards Commissioner, which would be an improvement on the present. However, I do feel that if there is to be a new body that might potentially require either a vote of the House or even primary legislation, which would certainly require a vote of the House, the reason why I have sort of said, well, the parties must take the lead is that although a number of the party leaders, including the Prime Minister, have referred to Parliament as the institution, the fact is that Parliament is overwhelmingly made up of members of political parties. And therefore it is really only if the parties come together and agree to bring forward change, including legislation, that that change can happen. And the idea that it is for the Speaker to lead that whole process, I think, is wrong. Is there, however, a role for me to play in terms of advocacy and facilitation? I think there is. And, you know, I'm certainly not running away from my responsibility, but I don't think the Speaker should seek to impose a blueprint, but the Speaker should be a facilitator. Do I think the continued presence of hereditaries in the House of Lords cheapens democracy? I'm not sure that I want to use the term cheapens. I certainly think it is wrong. And I was, back in, I think, 2007, when there was a whole series of votes on House of Lords reform, and I voted for either a wholly or a predominantly elected second chamber. I voted for different options, but I was very much in the elected second chamber camp. I was, I think, on that occasion, the only Conservative MP in 2007 who voted for the immediate removal of all of the hereditary peers, because I simply thought that it was utterly unsustainable that in the 21st century, a part of the legislature should include people who were there by accident of birth. Now, I think that my view was a pretty unremarkable view, though it was remarked upon that I was the only Tory MP who voted for the immediate removal of the said hereditary peers. What you might think is mildly amusing about it is that my constituency chairman at the time, who I hasten to add was a very supportive and good constituency chairman, was himself an hereditary. He wasn't in the Lords at the time. He was James Younger, the son of the late George Younger, Secretary of State for Defence and Secretary of State for Scotland. And James was very keen to become, it wasn't totally clear at the time, but it became clear later that he was very keen to become an hereditary peer. And he did become a hereditary peer. And I hasten to add James Younger, who is, I think, even now a member of the government, you know, he's a very capable chap, and he was a very good Conservative Association chairman for me. He lives in my constituency. He's a very agreeable fellow, but he is an hereditary peer. And there was no froideur in our subsequent conversations. He showed no indication of hostility or resentment. But one or two people said to me, John, it's quite amusing that you were a key advocate of this. Your own constituency chairman is one of these hereditary types, and he might possibly take umbrage. And I said, well, when's that ever bothered me in the past?
Thank you very much. That was a fascinating session. It has shown that you don't bear any grudge against William Hague at all. Downstairs, just outside...
William, I should just say, by the way, sorry,
You're coming between them and the wine, you know that.
All right. Well, William improved the Conservative Party's representation in Parliament from 165 when he became leader in 1997 to 166 at the 2001 election. Now, on my reckoning, to be fair, I mustn't do him a disservice. On my reckoning, William would have become Prime Minister at that rate of progress at the age of 840.
Actually, it's worse than that. It's because in 2001, the one Conservative gain net was made by the fact that in Tatton, Martin Bell stood down and George Osborne took the seat. There wasn't actually any gain at all on that basis, but for Tatton, the Conservative Party made no gains at all in 2001. So
What, you mean he would never have become Prime Minister? What a tragedy for the nation.
On that note, on that Hague bombshell, outside there is some wine. It is proof for all of you that that is not where your fees are going, as you will discover as soon as you have a glass. But please show your appreciation in the usual manner.
You were fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. Wow. I just want to say thank you. What order? What's not to like about talking to and hearing from students? It's been huge fun. Thank you very much.